Welcome back to the third and final part of the Washington State Wine Deep Dive 2021. I'm, of course, Interpreting Wine host and founder Lawrence Francis across 3 episodes exploring the terroir, geology, winemaking culture, and wines of the US's second largest quality wine producing region. We conclude the series today with an in-depth look at Walla Walla with Matt Reynvaan of Reynvaan Family Vineyards. Building on episode 443, which looked at the wider Columbia Valley, and 444, which focused on Yakima Valley, we first hear Matt's origin story, a fascinating introduction to the wine industry, literally from scratch, in 2004. He puts the family decision to start a new winemaking endeavour in a new region in the context of the help that they received along the way from both the local and international winemaking communities. Before we embark on a podcast first, a 2017 Syrah vertical, tasting 3 wines, firstly in the rocks, secondly in the hills, and finishing with the contender. Before Matt talks about the market for these wines, both locally and internationally. Before finishing by looking ahead for both Walla Walla and the wider Washington State winemaking region. Enjoy.
So in 2004, I moved from Scottsdale, Arizona, up to Walla Walla, where my parents had just purchased a house. And it was a house that now is where the winery and the Foothills Vineyards sit. But at that point, I had no interest in wine. I thought it was cool and I had a place to live. But I was in the golf business before. So when I came to Walla Walla, I started working at the country club. And being in this valley, you start to catch the bug of winemaking and drinking it and just enjoying the people around it. And I kind of wanted to take a shift towards that direction. And there was an opportunity to play with the Loca 41 guys in a golf tournament, a charity tournament. And I was back then, a stick. I was really good. And so I was kind of their ringer. And we were out playing and, they kind of had heard that I was maybe interested in getting in the wine business. And so Mike Sharon, the former winemaker there, said, Matt, I hear you were looking for a job. I said, yeah, I'm trying. He goes, okay, this next hole will put you to the test here. So we were on this par 5 and we were trying to, get on the green in 2. And he says, I'll tell you what, if you can get this within 10 feet of the pin, I will see what I do about getting you a job. And so I'm thinking, okay, nothing to lose. I step up there, I hit this 6-iron from 200 yards, and it landed on the green, bounced once or twice, and rolled up to a foot to the pin, the hole. And he goes, "You're hired." And so I began my first wine job at L'Ecole for an internship in 2004 vintage. From there, I started to think I should do some schooling because we were talking about maybe making this into a business, and you want to get some background. And we knew Christophe Baron and Charles Smith very well, and Christophe, we tried to get him as a consultant, and he kind of said, I'm not interested in doing this. I don't have the time, and he's a busy guy. And I think over just drinking wine, getting to know us, he took a kind of an interest in the idea that we wanted this to be a family business for a long period of time. And, we had just bought this property that had, all this land, about 40 plus acres. And Christophe came up here and said, this is not a good site to start. And it had residual chemicals from all the farming that's been done around here, but it was intriguing, at least to the potential. But he said, if you really want to start off with a bang, I have a piece of property down in what's now the Rocks District, because I think if I'm going to do this, I want us to start there and build from that Rocks District. And so we bought this piece of land, and started thinking about exactly what we wanted to do. We knew it was going to be Syrah to begin with, but we also wanted to incorporate some whites in there. So we talked it over, and we decided we had to do some Viognier. We loved to drink it. It was perfect for co-fermenting if we wanted to go that route. And then we also picked Marsanne, which no one had really done. But we thought, let's try this, try to be different and find a style that we like. And so we ended up planting 5 acres in 2005. And then we had, we weren't going to buy any fruit or juice from anyone to make wine. We wanted to do it completely estate from the beginning. So in the interim, Christoph said, Matt needs to get out and get some experience. Let's see what we can do before 2007 when the vines could potentially have, the ability to make wine. So I ended up going from L'École, doing a little bit of school at the Walla Walla Enology program. And school is just not the best avenue for me for learning. I need my hands dirty. I need to get out there. And so I ended up, planting the vineyard with, our first 5 acres with the crew, which was an amazing task. The farming down there is incredible. It's the solid, river rock. That was a learning experience. But I had to find other things to do because once the vines were in, there's a little bit of watering, some tractor maintenance. But at that time, the Cayuse crew would just hop over and do it quick. And so I was, didn't have a lot to do back then. So I ended up getting a job at K Vintners, working for Charles Smith, basically doing, the tasting room, the shit work, the kind of beat me up. But what Charles really had was, he has a great cellar, and he's very serious about his craft, which is being a negociant, I think. And so I had kind of the best in Christoph teaching me vineyards and working with Charles in the cellar because he would bring in samples from everywhere and kind of, start blending. And so I got an idea of what it takes to blend, what we're looking for in different aspects and, taking care of barrels and just really understanding. And then Charles was very generous with his cellar. And so he would open up, crazy bottles and introduce me to some of the older ones. And Christoph would come over. They were friends back then and drank like fish and all these amazing wines that, these old Clops, some Chateauneuf, some old Bordeaux. And, Charles would say, hey, Matt, go back to the cellar and get anything except the Petrus or the Pingus or something like that. And so I had pretty good line to some awesome wines. And so I did that for about a year. And then I still had one more year before the vines could, be ready to harvest potentially. So my neighbor in Walla Walla became a great friend of mine, and actually is a world famous artist named Jim Dine. And he did a sculpture over in Bordeaux at Chateau Smith Haut Lafitte. And I had been looking, and Christoph was trying to secure me an internship and couldn't get the one in the Rhone, which would have been best. But he says, it's important for you to be in France and learn the French style of winemaking and living in the vines. And so said Bordeaux is a different, animal than the Rhone, but you need to do it. And Jim's wife, Diana, called Madame Catillard, and I was able to get over there to work the 2006 harvest and learned, it was life-changing to be a part of that and to see what it takes and, the connections they had, the places we went, the other tasting the wines of Bordeaux, how they make it. And, I just fell in love with it. And then I came back, man, I was ready to go for our vines. And I got back, and 2007 was a phenomenal year. And we ended up making a small amount off the 5 acres. We made 2 Syrahs, one called the Contender and one was In the Rocks. And we also made a white wine called Queen's Road White. And so that gets you up to, the first vintage, and we were off and running.
You've covered so much there. And I think reaching, as I am, the third interview of the series, you've really kind of, I think, echoed many of the sentiments that I think especially one Munozoka was talking about in our interview, just around the community, and just around, he was talking to people moving to the area, being able to afford land, being able to essentially get their foot on the ladder in a sense in that region, which it may not have been possible in so many other regions. And I'm just curious, for context, really, I mean, was that a part of the story by which the family and your family actually moved there? I mean, it's the name is still very much there on the bottles in terms of Reynvaan family vineyards, and I'm just curious then, was that community, was that accessibility a key part of them deciding to move to the region?
My parents would say they wanted a smaller, they knew something was happening in Walla Walla in terms of the growth. They were looking at maybe doing an investment property of a house by Whitman. My dad went to Whitman and thought maybe we'll use it and rent it out to some Whitman kids or something. They just enjoyed being in wine country. And they kept looking and nothing ever, felt right. But I don't think they had the intention of growing grapes or doing this. This wasn't like a lifelong thing. My dad was practicing law in Seattle, and I think they were just looking for a little escape. They knew Charles very well. My dad is Charles' lawyer. So, they just wanted to be a part of it. And after a while, the realtor's like, listen, if this isn't what you're looking for, I have a property out in the base of the foothills, the Blue Mountains that, is a lot more land, but it's kind of more what it seems like you guys, want to do. And they came of Cottonwood, which is, you're climbing up the hill. It's on the southeast part of Walla Walla. And they got up there, and my mom and dad described it as they pulled in, got out of the car, and it's an exceptional view of the valley, right? I mean, it was just beautiful for them. And my mom doesn't hesitate and says, this is it. And my dad was like, honey, this is like 6 times it. This is not what we're thinking. So, but my mom, has a great eye in real estate and saw the potential for, maybe vineyards, maybe just, there was all kinds of options. Yeah. And it's what became Foothills in the Sun. And to be quite honest, it's one of the most unique sites in the valley. So there is some, serendipitous, actions going in the way, because, I mean, from a group that had no knowledge of wine other than drinking it, we were now embarking on a large venture. And it happened very fast. And without the guidance of Christoph, it would have been a completely different way. He embedded so much knowledge. I was a sponge with him, listening to every aspect and studying. And so we ended up, like I said, not using this part at first, but ended up coming back to it after we had kind of cleaned up the soil, got some better nutrients in there, and planted 10 acres at the very top of the property, which is 1,600 feet. So we were already going with the In the Rocks property. And this one now, we were going to wait until our first vintage, which would be 2010 for them up here. And we ended up planting Viognier, a bunch of different clones and rootstocks of Syrah, and a little bit of Cabernet Sauvignon. So 2008 was a very busy year for planting. We had planted our first in 2005 In the Rocks, and then again in 2006, 2007, and the last little bit of Cabernet Sauvignon in 2008, as well as 10 acres of Syrah and Viognier and Cabernet at the Foothills Vineyard. And so from there, my mom was saying, we are burning through money, spending on these vines and, doing all this work. But I mean, we were committed, we were all in by then. And so we kind of did that for a while, and then started planting again in 2014. We had a little extra part of the In the Rocks vineyard that I had been planning for a long time to dedicate to more Bordeaux varietals because of my time in France and at Smith Lafitte. I wanted to do kind of the style of wine that they did, which is, more Cabernet Sauvignon, a higher percentage of that, a Merlot, Cab Franc, and a little bit of Petit Verdot. And, Petit Verdot, Madame Catillard always said, this is like, you just need a little bit. Don't plant a lot. It's too powerful, but just a little bit will really help the blend. And so we ended up doing that. And it started to, we had to wait till 2016 to see what the grapes would do. And so we ended up, in that time we had all this Cabernet from the In the Rocks previous that we made 100% Cabernet for since 2010. First commercial was 2011, and just kind of kept making 100% Cab. And then in 2016, once I saw the quality of the Bordeaux varietals down there, we ended up switching the wine from 100% Cab to a blend, and it made the wine so much better, so much complexity. And so that was the final planting that we did at In the Rocks. It's totally planted out. And then in 2018, we planted another 5 acres of Syrah, kind of my favorite clones that worked very well up here in a little block on the lower part of the property that I named after my son, called Pierce's Block, because he was born in 2018, and it was it's just coming online for the 2020, and it's been great. So that's the final planting that we're doing right now. My mom has cut off the checkbook, and we can focus on what we have.
You've started to describe there standing on the hillsides, actually orientating myself to the surroundings. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind giving us that sort of, 30,000 foot type view of Walla Walla, potentially relating this back to Washington State, I guess sort of really orientating people to potentially some of those more cataclysmic influences, which we have already touched on earlier in the series, and also that mountain range, which keeps it so dry as well.
Walla Walla, Washington is a small Appalachian Valley in the southeast corner of Washington State. So we reside on the eastern side of the Cascade Mountains, which gives us a protective barrier from the weather patterns off the ocean. So we have actually, people think of Washington as very rainy, which it is on the west side. Over on the east, we have almost 300 days of sunshine. So we have ideal conditions for growing lots of different varietals. It's about a 4-hour trip from Seattle or Portland by car. And we have, throughout the state, these different climates coming off the Cascades to very dry desert in the Yakima, moving towards the Tri-Cities, and then Red Mountain is about 50, probably an hour away west of Walla Walla. And you move from Red Mountain into kind of the outskirts of Walla Walla, where some of the beginning wineries like Rick Small, LaCole, Rick Small of Woodward Canyon, out in Loudon, and then you move into Walla Walla. And as you move closer into the valley, you start seeing a shift in the soils. It's primarily wheat growing, peas, onions, and as you get closer to the mountains, we go from 8 inches of rain per year on the western side, all the way to as high as 25 inches, and where we are here at the Foothills Vineyard. So drastic conditions in the valley and across the state, and there's a lot of great little pockets of different terroirs. And so we work exclusively in the Walla Walla Valley. But what's interesting, what we do is we have our vineyard, the Foothills, that is, this windblown loess, deep silty loam that's attributed to the Missoula floods that happened. And then we also work with the rocks, which is an alluvial fan that kind of surrounds the valley. And so we have these rocky soils kind of down in Milton Freewater going around towards the airport. And actually most of it is in the town of Walla Walla, because a lot of the farmers who farm here didn't know they thought the rocks were an impediment. They didn't understand the amazing their terroir they're building the courthouse on. We fortunately the Milton Freewater, where the Rocks district is, a lot of the people who planted down there were apple trees, different fruit trees, and it stayed that soil, and they didn't plant. It was all farmland. Where you get closer to the foothills, it's mostly wheat fields, alfalfa, and these deep, silty, loam soils that are great for growing a lot of different crops. So what's cool about us is we have the hillside aspect of one terroir, and then we have the rocks, the ancient riverbed, and we use similar techniques at both. So we have a really cool idea of these little microclimates in the valley to show different styles from what all these places can create.
I'm super privileged because we've got a setup in front of both of us. We've got a horizontal tasting, so we've got the same grape, we've got the Syrah, we've got it yourself, the same producer, and we've got the same vintage 2017. And before we go in and really sort of start to explore those differences that you've alluded to there in terms of the terroir that's being expressed through the grape, I wonder if you wouldn't mind talking perhaps a little bit to your philosophy and the big picture, I guess, really, in terms of what similarities there may well be between these wines before we later explore the differences between the sites.
When I first began with the consulting help of Christophe Baron of Cayuse Vineyards, he said to us, I'm here to get you guys to find your own style. I don't want to guide you along to make a similar, like a Cayuse, cousin of Cayuse type of thing. He said, you guys really need to find your style. So we started drinking some wines that we have enjoyed, and the particular Syrahs that we felt were some of the best in the world. In fact, we did a blind tasting of different wines. And we kind of all landed on the wines that were co-fermented. Mm-hmm. So we had in the beginning planned to make a wine that has a white grape co-fermented with the red grape. Those are the styles that we really liked. It's a more elegant style. It's in wines that I found throughout the world. I think some of the older Gongelofs have a beautiful ability to have the Viognier and Syrah in there. And I thought that when we first started out, we really thought we were only going to make 2 or 3 wines. But as it evolved, we've now make a lot more. But I think the core of what we do began with this Syrah co-fermented with Viognier. And then we kind of experimented with other things through the years and have added new wines that, because I love 100% Syrah, I think it's just, that wine just can't lie. It is what it is. You can't put anything in there to hide or mask anything. It's just, here it is. So we ended up doing that later on as we built our portfolio of wines. But I honestly, I look to the greatest producers to get inspiration and see what they do, see what I like about it, see what I don't like about it, But in the end, people say, you're trying to make a wine like this? I said, no, I'm more in the category of I want to make the best wines from our terroir and start developing that narrative of Washington, especially Walla Walla Valley for us, is one of the greatest places to grow grapes in the world. And so we're trying to build upon that and showcase the type of terroir that we have that is very special. So philosophy for me is beginning in the vineyard, having great grapes, and in the cellar, I've learned that the less you intervene with the wine, the less you try to manipulate it. It really is the best if you just have perfect grapes and have good vessels to carry them through. So we do very simple upbringings in stainless steel. It's quick fermentation. It's all on our own native yeast. I've never introduced an outside commercial yeast. I think that was something that you learn very quickly. The best producers in the world tend to have their native yeast. And there's different schools of thought on it, but that's what works for me. And I like the fact that it's wild and then it jumps around and it creates its own, soul and character in the wine that feels very much like this is a Reynvaan wine. So I'm not much of a science guy. I wouldn't like to work with that. So I just have to trust that our yeast is strong enough. So we eventually, first we started our first couple vintages doing custom crush down at Cayuse Vineyards. We hadn't built our building yet. So the first 2007, 2008, and 2009 were done at Cayuse Vineyards. And so in the meantime, we were preparing to build our building. And, we have respect for the farmers and land over here, that we wanted to build a winery that would work for us, but wouldn't be this ostentatious kind of showpiece, because we are all about the wine. So we built basically what looks like a barn that is extremely functional and ideal for creating the kind of wines we do. So we started in 2010 and at our first vintage at the new facility. And I think we kind of carried over some of the cayuse, some of the yeast that may have been picked up from his cellar. And then over time, ours has developed more because it came into a clean environment, and we've kind of developed our own strain. And honestly, if I feel like you need the science in winemaking when you screw up, it seems like, if you just get out of their way and you taste all the time, you see what kind of, if you have to do, give it extra or back off, pump overs, punch downs, or nothing, does the wine need more air? I'm not a recipe winemaker. I see what I have in the year and make decisions from then on. And then once it finishes fermentation, for our red program, I will put it in barrel, and I typically use a lot of neutral oak, just because I don't want to mask any of the stuff we've worked so hard for in the vineyard. And then it's on an aging process, anywhere between 10 months and 18 months for the syrahs. And it's very clean, but I don't fine the wine. I don't filter it. We rack it, every once in a while. But it's not I like the ruggedness of it, because there's so much character in the lees that we use it for quite some time until we need to rack it. And it creates that kind of style. But I mean, I had to learn a lot since 2010, understanding the blocks as the wine, the syrahs are getting older in age in the vines. So you start to learn, and I always like to experiment with, more stems, less stems, all berry, different types of things. And I see what works and what doesn't. And some years it works great. And then you think, oh, that will work again next year. And it absolutely doesn't work at all. And we end up having to, declassify the wine and put it in a different, brand or something. But I don't like to intervene too much. I just think it's very important to taste and realize you stick to that style.
You're not the first winemaker to talk about science and I guess the application of their knowledge in that way. I think it has been a trend, and I would say for me, and based on the conversations I've had, it has been more with sort of old world winemakers in Spain and Austria. A couple of them come to mind. That you go out there and you're taught how to make wine, and then they have really said the same thing. That they've really learned how to make wine by making wine, by being on the ground, by observation, by crunching up the seeds and the grapes in their mouth and tasting. But, having that, I guess, get out of jail free card by understanding the science and understanding what's going on and the processes that are going on there, you need it as well, really, if you're going to be sort of, self-sufficient and potentially going on that journey of exploration. This is incredible. I'm loving the way that you've set up the terroir. That the listeners will by now already be quite familiar with, this being the third part of the series. But now we've got to hear from you. Your situation there, the influences that have guided you, and now I just throw the door open and invite you to take us first of all through the In the Hills as we start to get deep into vineyard by vineyard and wine by wine.
So the 2017 In the Hills is a wine that is co-fermented with Viognier. I believe it's about 6-7% in there. And what's so striking, I think, from the from the bouquet is the gamey, peppery notes that you would find in some places like San Joseph, those kind of more rugged notes, some Côte Rôtie. But this is on soil, this deep, silty loam that has no kind of minerality structure in the soil, but it does have its own characteristics really from this. It's a hillside vineyard. So we have, this was the second vineyard that we planted was in this hillside one, and it's not planted by the book. I studied in the times that I had just on a tractor. I would go out and just see what happens, because from the air, if you're looking at these wheat fields, it just looks like they're, a flat field. But once I started getting on the tractor, I noticed these small different angles where there was a slope kind of southwest facing, and then there was this ease going east-west, this gentle slope that I ended up planting most of the vines on. And it was kind of a risk because by the book, people are like, don't do that. But it was, Christophe said later, this is what people in France do. They plant for ease of farming. It's what you have is what what you get. And so we ended up doing that. And I think some of the most Rhone-like notes come from this vineyard. I mean, you pick up the bouquet with the Viognier in there, obviously a touch of that dried apricot, but you get white pepper, you get the gaminess, almost like a lamb dish with a touch of rosemary, kind of that herb de Provence. And the bouquet, it just keeps going and going, expanded so much over time. And when you drink it, we have natural acidity up here. We don't have to acidify the wines from the foothills because it's just natural in it, where we do in the rocks, syrah. So it brings a freshness. It brings kind of a linear, focus in this wine, but it's extremely balanced, and it has all of the elements I'm looking for in a higher elevation syrah. So it's one of my favorites, and I think that this is one that in blind tastings, people don't believe that this is from Washington State because it has its own characteristic that's not like every other wine in Washington, and they lean towards the Rhone, even though this is this is made in our little tiny town of Walla Walla. So,
and I think this is where having that influence from Christophe Baron, I think this will maybe give you a deeper understanding, but potentially, who knows with wine sometimes. But I mean, has he kind of hypothesized around that link and that connection that you're talking about there in terms of the wine that's coming out very much is reminding people and reminding yourselves of those Rhone wines, but the terroir is so different. Obviously, the location is so different. The access to water and the growing conditions are so different. Is there a hypothesis around how come the wines are coming out kind of so reminiscent and feel so familiar?
Yeah, we've talked about that many times over the years. I think that terroir it's such an interesting thing because a lot of people think of it as just the soil, but the other aspects of terroir that we get up here is different exposure with the orientations of the rows. We have wind patterns that make the vines stronger. There's a big the weather will hit the hills and drop and then go back through the valleys. So we have different kind of weather patterns. I think it's very important too, the clonal diversity when you're planting. I personally wanted to have as many ingredients to work with to create a wine, because you want to have, these certain characters in the Syrah grape, and there's so many different ways to do it, that when we bring all these lots together and line them up to try to create these wines, they all have their own personality. And my job is to bring them together in a harmonious way that follows that style that we've set out to do long ago. for each of these wines. And I treat each wine like a child, like I love them all. I want them to be perfect. And I just, so when I dial in for In the Hills, I know what I'm looking for. I know what I have. And I do that with every single wine that we do.
Okay. Yeah, this is absolutely stunning. I think having researched and looked at the, I guess, available literature on the wines, I'm potentially being guided by some of those tasting notes that talking around olives and tapenade and that kind of almost like briny, olivey characteristic.
Yeah, extremely briny.
It's and so Moorish though. That's the thing. And actually, it did just occur to me. I don't know if you feel as though the Viognier, which I'm certainly picking up as you're describing there, is its influence, I guess, over the Syrah and over the blend. Is it more felt on the nose than on the palate for you, or are you these wines, the 100% Syrahs that you're doing over there? Are you tasting as well the influence of that 6-7%?
Yeah, and I think that sometimes the amount of Viognier that we put in here can get away, and it becomes too overwhelming. I personally like kind of the 2 to 5% inclusion in it. But the way that we blended this year, for this particular vintage, there was a lot that was excellent, that just had a little more Viognier, so it brought that percentage up. But I think it's balanced enough with the Syrah that it's not too overpowering, but because it can be, 2 more percentages, and people would think this tastes more like Viognier than it does a Syrah, and I don't ever want to get to that point. But I think I taste in there, because when we do the Viognier, I will typically do whole cluster Viognier at the bottom of a tank, and then put the Syrah on top of it. So I taste the stems and the skins of the Viognier, that the way they're grown up here, they're a little more intense than the Viognier that's in the Rocks vineyard. So it's a little more grittier. It's a little more tension in it. But I like that. It wakes people up, gets their attention. But it does have that beautiful elegance and grace that I want with these other kind of really raw masculine notes. Like you said, that almost like a briny, irony olive tapenade. It's very cool. I think that's what's fun about this site.
Reading those descriptions, for me, they are very accurate, and they are things that I love. Thankfully, to eat. But I think it's just so interesting that I just think they for me, there's just that missing part of the description that you filled in there, really, just around the harmony, around the completeness of the wine, which I think, for me, obviously then elevates it far beyond any of those components, that briny note, the salinity, the tapenade, the olive, taken in isolation. It's just a far more complete taste experience that actually I think it's a little bit difficult to put into words at times. So
moving on now to the second wine, we are going to be drinking the 2017 In the Rocks, which is, I chose this wine because it's very similar in its upbringing. It has Syrah and Viognier co-fermented as well, and it shows the diversity of the valley. We go from being at 1,600 feet on a hillside down into the Rocks District, which is an ancient riverbed. If people listening, picture Châteauneuf-du-Pape with the big boulders. That's what it is. And it makes for fantastic growing. And it's the vineyard that we made our first wines from. So the 2017 was co-fermented with, I believe, 4% Viognier in there. What you're going to pick up right away is the more, I would say it's more of a weight to this wine. There's more of a savory characteristic. It doesn't jump out with the brightness that the In the Hills had. It's more of the richer, more Hermitage style, where it's a warmth that brings in with the Syrah. That's kind of the initial the tastes of it. The smell, I pick up the Viognier in there. This one will typically see a little bit more oak in its élevage, maybe from 30 to 35%, but it really depends. And I tend to age in the rocks a little bit longer than the foothills wines. So you pick up the oak a little bit, but it depends really. Sometimes I've switched coopers, I've gone over different things, and you finally find the ones that work best with your grapes, and I use about 3 to 4 coopers, and it's harmonious now, and I think I've got it dialed in, but we'll see. But this wine, for me, you pick up the minerality in it, the wet stone, you pick up the fruit characteristics, kind of a black cherry almost. I think if you dive deeper into it, you get some of that white flower characteristic. Lots of smoked meats. Yeah, it's one of these wines that you open it and can leave it open and it just expands and expands and expands. So I'm picking up now kind of some blackberry in there, some kind of crushed blackberry. But still, I think as you taste it, it's got that. It feels like it might be heavy, but then when you taste it, it's very elegant in style. It's very flows through, it kind of cascades through the palate.
Is this a hotter area? This sounds as though this is going to potentially trap a lot more of that heat down there.
It's very unique because it gets very warm. And the whole idea behind having the soils with these exposed cobblestones is we want them exposed, because what's so cool about it is it captures all the heat during the summer and through the fall. And then we have these huge diurnal shifts where the temperatures can drop almost 40 degrees. And we still have this heat coming from the rocks that radiates back into the canopy and onto the grapes. And you have this cold air preserving the acid in there. So it makes it a totally unique place to grow grapes. And so what's nice about that is it continues to ripen throughout the night, which gives us optimal time to get this ripe. And so it becomes a wine that, has more of that warmth to it that you can feel, but not where it's too heavy of a wine where you can only have a glass of it. I feel that any wine of ours, you should be able to sit and drink the whole bottle if you want. It's refreshing almost.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just curious as well, though, is this wine still representing a large percentage of that 2004 fruit? Or have we now got sort of, the different generations of Syrah now coming through into this blend?
Yeah, we have. I've learned enough about the different parcels that we have, the kind of blocks of the different clones, and I know what I'm looking for now since it's all been planted out, and I see what's what. There's kind of a few of them that are the backbone of this particular wine that I go to every year, and I know that's a great place to start. And then as we see some of these other Syrahs, I will do like all berry in one tank, because we make the wine in these small 1.5 ton tanks. So I have all these options where I can do all berry, some whole cluster, some bunches, or a mix of different things. And so I have what I know is the backbone of each wine. And then I have all these other Syrahs that I can play with to create the style. And I want it to be, it's evolved significantly since the 07 vintage in the rocks, but it's kept its profile and its character all the way through, and it just keeps getting better and better. The vines keep getting older. In the wine world, they're very, very young, but over here they've got some age on them, and we're starting to see that develop and get more intense. And I never wanted to get too intense. I don't want to be that kind of Syrah producer. I want to be one that has that balance and finesse and elegance. And so I try to get that every year, and I never try to push too hard for changing that style, because I think this wine is singular in its style.
I imagine we're on the same sort of line of thinking, because really the reason behind my question was because what this wine strikes me as is actually, an older wine, or an almost more detail, but almost beyond that, almost I know we like to characterize wine as people, but it's almost like one of those people you meet that's quite sure of themselves and kind of knows who they are and kind of knows their own personality, and that's why it actually is quite a shock to me to learn really the youth of these vines, and it's just funny to hear you saying for over there these are towards the older side, but for me and I guess the potentially a lot of the listeners, that 2004 as a planting, 2007 first vintage is still going to be relatively young in 2021.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so this is a marathon. This is not this is a generational thing that grandkids will see the vines, and I would love to make wines as long as I can, and with these as the vines grow. But yeah, they're still babies, and we're getting more and more nuances in the wines. And I think this, like you said, it has its own personality where it walks in and it's confident, it knows what it is, has a story to tell, and I think it's just a wonderful wine. I mean, I speak of them, like you say, like people, because they do. They all have their own personalities.
Super interesting to have, heard you describe in the hills and in the rocks, and now we meet the third of the siblings, the contender. So please take us inside the glass and explore the terroir in which these grapes are grown for this wine.
So moving on to the third wine here with the contender. It comes from the same vineyard from the previous wine, the In the Rocks vineyard. But what makes this one unique is it's a wine that we co-ferment with the white grape Marsanne. Mm-hmm. And I still can't find people who do that. I've heard in different parts of Southern Rhone, they play around with Syrah Marsanne. And it's a wine that we kind of took a gamble on, but we fell in love with the style because it's a beautiful bridge from the standard Syrah Viognier to the 100% Syrah with this other kind of powerful white grape of the Marsanne. And Marsanne by itself is remarkable and some of the greatest wines, white wine made in the world for my personal palate. So we thought, let's try and add a little bit. And boy, did we not need to add very much, because it was amazing. It just brought this mouthfeel characteristic, this like coating, almost glycerin, just this oily texture to it. And it was so fun because it has a richness and a power to it that's more like it feels like it might not have white wine in there, but if you know the Marsanne grape, you pick it up. And it's not as much about the aromatics with the white. It's all about the mouthfeel and the texture of it. So I use anywhere from 2% to the highest amount was, I believe, 10% Marsanne. And it was in 2009. And for some reason, it just worked. But after that, 10% was way too much. It just needs the 2 to 4%, I think. So, and it's a wine that we made from the beginning. So we took a gamble, and that first time we made it, we were thinking, okay, we're either going to have to, it's either going to be wonderful or we're going to be ripping it out of the vineyard, because it truly was a gamble. But there's something magical that happens. It's a more hedonistic wine. It's darker. It's more brooding. It's got this cocoa, crushed blackberry richness to it. And you'd think it'd be something where it'd be hard to drink. It might be too much. But again, I'm all about this balance. And you see my personal style in here without it. Because you have to keep kind of your own style for each of the wines, but also a style for the entire brand of wine with Reynvaan. So that's what I try to achieve with this one. And I think this one is going to be very long-lived. It's a wine that's going to hold wonderfully. All of them should be, but the contender just has that amazing backbone.
Okay, and I have to ask about the name. Is there a particular story behind that?
Yeah. So my dad and I one night maybe had too many glasses of wine, and this wine was in the barrel, and we were thinking about names. And let's just say we're better at growing grapes and making wine than coming up with names. But Dad, kind of slurred speech said, "I want to contend with the best wines in the world. Let's call it the Contender." And I'm like, "Dad, you need to write that down. That was good. We're not going to remember if you don't write it down." And so he wrote it down, thank goodness. And, it just felt like it because it just had that like, God, you could take this anywhere in the world and it would hold up, Yeah. And so we ended up calling it the Contender. And my dad being a lawyer, trademarked the name for the wine industry. So it was pretty great that we had it and stayed with it the whole time.
It's actually really interesting to me as well, just, hearing the way that you're talking about these wines, it feels like quite a French way to describe the wines in terms of talking about their upbringing and you sort of, showing their path through there. And I think, I've really enjoyed you describing these three wines kind of as they are now, but then also just talking to how they have been and how they sort of might be in the future. And I think that's really interesting for me because it kind of shows you, that kind of situation where you see three Syrahs or three Syrah dominant wines from the same producer. But I hope that we've sort of reinforced that they're completely different wines and that you may well be in the mood for one of these, more so than another at that particular time. One thing that intrigued me a little bit around the way that you described these three wines, Matt, was there seemed to be more of an emphasis on the soil, I guess, and the growing conditions, and the way that they were co-fermented, potentially over and above talking about the growing conditions and kind of what was happening around them in 2017. And I just wonder, it's just an open question really, is that potentially speak to the way that you like to talk about wine, or does it also potentially bring in a little bit around those sort of perfect growing conditions that you've described over in Washington State, where potentially the winemaker through irrigation and just simply through the fact of the region and it being so dry, where vintage variation is potentially not as strong an influence as it might be?
It's a loaded question, but it's very good. So if we just first look at 2017, it was a year that we had moved from hot year to hot year to hot year in the previous vintages. And in 17, it was looking like it was going to be the same kind of thing. Global warming was taking over and we all needed to move off the planet type of thing. I mean, it was heating up quickly. It ended up being a hot year, but we had, there was lots of wildfires that have been happening recently, and they happened on the West Coast. And through the kind of hottest periods in 2017, we had high elevation smoke, not surrounding any of the vineyards, but blocking the sun. So it was a very interesting thing that we had absolutely no control over, that made it benefit the wine because we didn't have that cooked characteristic that in a hot year you can sometimes really have to manage. So you always go in hoping for the best in a vintage. It's going to be ideal conditions. But I think it's more interesting to myself, to the consumer, in years that are difficult, that are cooler and not just warm and perfect conditions, because I feel that anyone can make wine in perfect conditions. But when you have, trying to get ripe, trying to manage canopy in hot years or different things like that, those are the most exciting wines and the ones that you really remember. because they had to struggle. They had to find a way to make it. And I think it's a great thing that Washington has. It doesn't just, it's usually very good weather, but sometimes there's, there are challenges every year with our changes in the winter, the temperatures that we have. It's not always perfect, but we're very fortunate that we have a long growing season. And, if we miss out at the beginning, we might catch up later, or if it gets too hot early, we might slow down and end of summer. And so it throws you curveballs, but we do what we can. And that's why I think having our own vineyards, it's wonderful, because we can go and I can be there in a flash. One vineyard, I'd look out my window and can see what I need to do. So
yeah, it's bringing the question of the commute, which so many of us at the moment we're commuting to the kitchen table, and I guess that's been a reality for you for some time now. Potentially to sort of draw back a little bit and just sort of characterize my own experience with these wines is I'm not sure if I would have appreciated them fully 5 years ago. I think again for somebody potentially slightly younger in their wine journey, I'm not sure if they're necessarily looking for all of those, for me now, amazing striking characteristics that each of these wines and the personality that they bring, and the opening up the fantastic pairing possibilities that may well exist. And I just wonder if we can start to sort of broaden out the discussion slightly and talk a little bit to how these wines are being enjoyed firstly in Washington, and I know that you have an oversubscribed mailing list, and just start to sort of talk about how these wines are being enjoyed out there in the world.
I think that everyone's palate changes throughout their whole life. Sometimes these wines are not for everyone. It's a particular style that we believe in, and I could make wine 1,000 different ways, but this is the way I decided to do it. And I think younger people might not younger people, but just when you're beginning in this, you might be looking for something or expecting something. I think as you go along and find what you truly like to drink, a lot of people start to gravitate towards that style. They're like, I never knew Syrah could taste like this. I never knew that you could make this style here, and they kind of are attracted to it. And our customers, are very well versed in the wine world. They buy from all over, and we have very loyal following. And I think what's really fun about it is we do have an overcrowded list, but some people want to move on. They don't like the style anymore, and their palates have changed, and they go somewhere else, and that's fine. It gives room for new people, but I always like to keep some extra wine for distribution to different markets to get it out there, because if you continue to sell to the same people, you're kind of taking away other people's potential experience. So we like to get it out there, not incredibly well, big amounts, but coming over and getting the wines, imported over to you guys, in the UK. That was a big step for me, because I thought, that they would enjoy the style and something unique. Yeah. And I think that it's it just depends on who's enjoying the wines at this time, and are they continuing to like it? I mean, because I'm gonna make the wines that I like to make, and I'm gonna have people who are going to be lifelong fans, and other people who will go somewhere else, and maybe they'll come back, maybe they won't, but you have to do it for yourself. You can't. Yeah. I want to be remembered as a consistent, when you think of Shav, or when you think of these great Syrah places, they're doing it their way. They're not trying to please anyone else. They're doing it their way, and that's what we want to do.
I think perfect segue. I think you really set it up nicely there. To start talking about, maybe a little deep dive into the UK, potentially introducing Esther and the relationship there. And then, by all means, bringing us bang up to date with this recent tasting.
So being that we are now in the UK, we had a group come over to visit us in Walla Walla, group of folks who are part of the entire wine system over there, came a couple years ago and were kind of blown away. They were just loving the wines. And one of the gentlemen, Adam Dugmore of Esther Wines, now imports our wines, and it's getting into the UK market. And we were fortunate to do this this tasting about a week ago, where they brought in different Syrah producers from around the world, and I was, honored to be a part of it. It was myself, Michel Chapoutier, a wonderful gentleman from making very cool wines out of Lebanon, and an Australian producer that was making wonderful wines as well. We weren't able to taste directly, but I've had some of their wines throughout the years. And so that was a big introduction because the people listening and were part of the system were amazing writers, somms, people in the wine industry in the UK market and abroad. And it was kind of a big hello to, Washington, Walla Walla wines. And we held our own. I think that a lot of the people who were watching were saying, this is exceptional. We need to start paying attention to what's happening. Yeah. And it was a big boost for me. I didn't piss off too many people. I thought I was going to, but I did okay. But I think it was a little eye-opening to the people taking part in it too. Like, wow, Reynvaan's getting a lot of, these Washington wines are very serious. And I think, that's what we've been looking for. The world's getting smaller. We want our wines to other people in the world to enjoy them, and being a part of, this kind of international tasting was wonderful and a great introduction for us to the world. I mean, because what's seen around the world is some of the larger producers, and we're one of the smaller boutique, kind of, I don't like the term cult wines, but, one of the more harder to get wines. And so to share them with people who really appreciate it, it was wonderful.
As very much tends to happen when I'm having these interviews and getting in tune, you've really set me up, I think, to close the interview, in which I always like to look ahead. I always like to end on a more speculative note. And I'm just wondering for you, over the next sort of 5 years, potentially zooming in on things like the marketing and the communication, what do you see as the opportunities for Walla Walla wine and the region? And then, potentially slightly longer term, over that sort of 20 years, which may well potentially bring in elements of winemaking and grape growing and more fundamental change even.
Well, I think that, going forward in the next 5, 10 years, 20 years down the line, I think we think about that because we want to be a generational winery as a state. And there's factors that you have to think about with, the global, climate, what's happening there will take effect in the vineyard. We need to obviously always be looking ahead. I think right now we're in a good spot, but, there's some scary trends coming. So we got to be aware of that. Maybe have to shift and pivot and do something different. But we're always very attentive in the vineyard. I think for growing our brand, I think the recognition in a larger scale, I think that when people hear of Syrahs, I hope Reynvaan is in their head and one of the ones to look to for great Syrahs around the world. And, I think that we just have to keep pushing the envelope and never rest on any sort of laurels that we have or achievements or accolades. Because in the end, we just make what we love, and the accolades will be there or they won't, but we're still going to be working incredibly hard. I don't think we want to expand the brand too much. If anything, just trying to dial in each wine and try to make them better each year. That's the goal. And, if things are permitting and we can do it, that's what we're going to continue to do. So I think the world, like I said, is getting smaller, and we're going to have to think about a larger clientele. And I look forward to hopefully being a part of that.
I would just ask you the same question, but for the entirety of Washington. I mean, this feels like a really incredible journey that I've been on, and have, feel like I've shared so much around where the region has come from, and I think have helped in breaking perceptions and some myths maybe that may have existed about Washington wine, and that they are making this incredible wine. And I just wonder what kind of comes to mind if I say, what is the I guess the broader opportunity for Washington wine, potentially domestically and then potentially internationally as well over that sort of same time period?
In terms of Washington as a whole, in terms of the kind of emerging wine region that people, what we're doing up here across the state, I think we need to, there's a good and a bad thing, is that we don't really have an identity, because it's good because we're able to grow so much, but you don't think Washington State and think of a particular varietal. I personally believe that. I think everyone's doing wonderful jobs with different varietals, so that makes it a little bit of harder to market throughout the world and in the United States, to be quite honest as well, because there's just a lot going on. So in terms of defining which varietal or what it's going to be that we're going to be known for, that will help us in our journey going forward. But I think that more and more talent is coming into the state. They have their own ideas. They want to make great wine. And just like any wine region that's developing, there's going to be some hits, there's going to be some misses. And I think it'll start getting tighter and tighter, and we will find our voice of what we do. And I think that the wines that are created here can rival some of the best in the world. And I hope people will see that and will take another look if they see a Washington wine and give it a try.
A huge thanks once again to Matt Reynvaan of Reynvaan Family Vineyards. If you know someone who would find this episode useful, do please share the direct link, which is interpretingwine.com/445. Please do see below for website and main social media handles for Reynvaan Family Vineyards. For those of you in the UK, I've also included details of their UK importer, Esther Wines. And do be sure to visit Washington State Wine online at washingtonwine.org, at Washington State Wine on Facebook, and at WA_state_wine on Twitter and Instagram. That is unfortunately the last episode of this fascinating deep dive into Washington State wines, a region I am so happy to have explored, and even happier to have been able to invite you along on this virtual journey. Please do help more people find this content about a region I hope you have come to know and love by leaving an iTunes review for episodes 443, 444 or 445. And please don't forget to come say hi on social media, where I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, and email hello@interpretingwine.com. See you next time.